Millionaire kicks wife and newborn baby out of the house because of the baby's skin color. Decades later, he sees her on the news. Dear viewers, welcome to our channel. Subscribe to receive more stories every day. Richard Bennett sat in his marble-tiled office, a place built on years of ambition, ruthless business moves, and above all, the unyielding drive for a legacy. At 55, Richard had built his empire from nothing, transforming Bennett Enterprises into a titan in the world of luxury and finance. Every detail of his life was crafted to reflect his success, from the sleek lines of his suits to the glittering glass towers that bore his name. But hidden beneath his success was a shadow, an unspoken chapter that he had buried as carefully as he'd buried his humble beginnings. It had been over 20 years since he'd cast aside that chapter, letting his anger and pride smother the whispers of guilt. His wife, Clara, had been the love of his life, or so he'd thought until that day in the hospital when he first laid eyes on their newborn daughter. Her skin, a few shades darker than his own, had sent him spiraling, filling him with a suspicion that overwhelmed his heart. He accused Clara, refusing her pleas, ignoring her tears, and brushing off the doctor's explanations that genetics often yielded surprises. That child could not be his. He was convinced. The shame, the fury, it all bubbled over until he demanded Clara leave, to take the child and never look back. And she had. Now, sitting alone in his office, Richard had the luxury to feel the emptiness echoing through his once vibrant life. With every business victory and every new acquisition, his sense of accomplishment felt increasingly hollow. His second marriage, a union of social status and convenience, had crumbled in bitter resentment and silence. He was left without an heir, without the legacy he had dreamed of passing down. He had always told himself that wealth, not blood, would carry on his name. But as his own reflection stared back at him from the glass of his towering office window, he felt something cold settle in, a foreboding he hadn't allowed himself to acknowledge before. Desperate to preserve his empire, he started reaching out to distant relatives and even close family friends with children of their own, seeking someone worthy of carrying the Bennett name. Yet no one had met his standards. None shared the same relentless drive, the same fire that had driven him. They were too soft, too complacent, too unworthy of the throne he had carved from nothing. Richard felt his options narrowing, and with each passing day, his thoughts returned like a haunting echo to the family he had cast out. Years before, Richard had heard whispers of Clara struggling to make ends meet. For a brief moment, he'd felt a twinge of guilt, a reminder of the life he'd forced her into. But just as quickly he dismissed it, confident that she'd find her way. After all, she had been strong once, hadn't she? And he'd convinced himself that by exiling her, he was securing his own legacy, untainted and pure. But now, that confidence faltered as he thought of his empty life, the empire he had built becoming meaningless without a successor to inherit it. One evening, while nursing a glass of his finest scotch, Richard made the decision to look for them, not out of kindness but out of necessity. The realization hit him like a stone in the pit of his stomach. He needed an heir, and his daughter, wherever she was, might be his only option. Through discreet channels, Richard hired a private investigator, a man who specialized in tracking down people long forgotten. The investigator was meticulous, combing through records, cross-referencing birth certificates, school registrations, even medical files. It took months, but finally, a name emerged. Evelyn Bennett. She had dropped her mother's last name years ago, reclaiming the Bennett name as her own, a twist that sent an unexpected surge of pride and curiosity through him. Perhaps she had something of him in her after all. But what Richard hadn't anticipated was just how far his daughter had come in life without him. Evelyn was no longer a child. She was a formidable presence in her own right. She had built a name for herself in the art world, her paintings a powerful fusion of raw emotion and elegant restraint, much like the father she had never known. Her works commanded high prices at prestigious galleries, and critics praised her as one of the rising stars of her generation. Richard's investigator handed him articles, interviews, and images of her with high-profile clients. Evelyn Bennett was not only successful but revered, an artist who captivated with her visions and stirred audiences to their core. Each article, each photograph of his daughter ignited a pride he hadn't felt in years. Yet, in equal measure, it stoked a pang of regret, a pain he couldn't ignore. She was everything he had hoped an heir to Bennett Enterprises would be. Intelligent, driven, and fiercely independent. But she was a stranger, a daughter who had lived her life without him. And though he hadn't yet met her, he felt an unease creep into his bones. How would she respond to his sudden appearance in her life? In his mind, Richard began to imagine the reunion. He pictured himself extending an invitation to a world she'd been denied, a chance to join him in the empire he had spent decades building. She would see the legacy he had created, the power and wealth he offered, and she would recognize that they were alike in ways no one else could understand. She would forgive him, he thought, seeing how his life of wealth and influence could become hers. They could begin again, father and daughter, reunited to bring Bennett Enterprises into a new era. With this vision, he instructed his assistant to arrange a meeting, sparing no expense on a private dinner in an exclusive club. A letter of invitation was sent to Evelyn, filled with flowery language that he hoped would convey both pride and affection. He congratulated her on her success, acknowledging her talent, and suggested that there were family matters of importance that they should discuss. For days, Richard felt an odd mixture of excitement and fear, emotions he hadn't felt since his youth. He replayed scenarios in his mind, imagining Evelyn's reaction to his olive branch. As the day of the meeting approached, he was met with silence. No acknowledgement of his letter, no response to his invitation. Days stretched into weeks, each one weighing heavier on him than the last. And then, just as he was beginning to consider a more direct approach, he received a letter. The letter was simple, elegantly written on cream-colored paper. Each word was precise, cold, and unyielding, much like the daughter he now realized he didn't know at all. Evelyn's words were polite but firm, stating that while she appreciated his acknowledgement of her work, she had no interest in discussing family matters with him. She had her own life, her own legacy, and she assured him, her own path that didn't require the Bennett name or the empire he'd built. The rejection cut deep. For a moment, Richard felt as though the air had been stolen from his lungs. He reread the letter, searching for a glimmer of hope, a clue that perhaps there was still a chance. But the words were final. She had made her choice, and it didn't include him. Staring at the letter, the reality he had long avoided settled over him. The daughter he had discarded had become everything he'd hoped for in an heir, yet she wanted nothing to do with him. In that moment, Richard felt the weight of his past choices, the sting of a regret that he could never undo. Days turned into weeks as Richard mulled over Evelyn's rejection. He had never been one to accept defeat easily, and though her response was as clear as it was decisive, it gnawed at him in a way that few things ever had. To him, this wasn't just about family. It was about redemption, a chance to build something deeper than the empire he had amassed. Yet every attempt to reach Evelyn was met with a quiet, impenetrable wall. She did not reply to his letters, ignored calls from his assistant, and rejected invitations to any events that bore his name. The harder he tried, the more elusive she became, as if she were a shadow slipping beyond his grasp. One cold November night, Richard found himself standing outside the gallery that represented her work. It was a sleek, modern space on the city's Art Avenue, where glass walls displayed vivid canvases that could be seen even from the street. He lingered on the sidewalk, watching patrons marvel at the vibrant paintings, raw, layered works that seemed to capture both beauty and melancholy. Her style was unmistakable, sweeping, intense strokes coupled with meticulous detail, like an artist who wrestled with both fire and restraint. The sight of her success stirred something unfamiliar in him. Pride, maybe. But more than that, an overwhelming desire to be part of her world, to understand the woman his daughter had become. Inside the gallery, patrons were captivated, moving between her pieces with reverence. He spotted one painting titled Roots of Silence, a sprawling canvas with muted tones and dark, haunting figures in the background, their forms twisted in shadows. The center held a lone figure, a young woman standing with her back to the viewer, gazing into the distance. The painting seemed to vibrate with longing, anger, and a depth of loneliness that struck Richard like a punch to the gut. Unable to resist, Richard approached the gallery owner, a well-dressed woman with an air of authority. After a brief exchange, she offered to introduce him to Evelyn, assuming he was just another collector intrigued by the artist. But when she realized his true identity, the woman's face hardened, a flicker of something unreadable in her eyes. "I'm not sure that would be wise, Mr. Bennet," she said carefully. "Evelyn is very private about her family, or lack thereof." The words stung, but Richard swallowed his pride. "Please, just a few minutes. She's my daughter." The gallery owner's hesitation was brief, though her expression softened with an edge of sympathy. "I'll let her know you're here, but don't expect a warm welcome." She disappeared into a back room, and Richard was left to linger once again, surrounded by strangers admiring the work of the daughter he hardly knew. Minutes passed, stretching thin, each one filled with an anxious anticipation. Just as he was beginning to lose hope, the door opened, and Evelyn emerged. She was taller than he remembered, poised with an elegance and strength that demanded attention. Her gaze, sharp and unwavering, met his without hesitation. There was no warmth, no recognition of a bond. She was a stranger, and yet in the depths of her eyes, he saw something of himself, an unyielding determination, the same cold fire that had driven him all his life. But instead of comforting him, the sight unsettled him. "Mr. Bennet," she greeted, her voice as cool as the autumn breeze. "I heard you wanted to speak with me." Richard hesitated, fumbling for words. "Evelyn, I came to see your work. I wanted to see you in person, to tell you how proud I am of what you've accomplished. You've built an incredible career." She remained impassive, her expression unreadable. "Pride from a father I don't remember feels hollow. Is that all?" Her bluntness cut through him, but he pressed on. "I know you have no reason to trust me or even want to be near me, but I hoped you'd give me a chance to reconnect. Maybe even make amends." A flicker of something, anger perhaps, passed across her face. She laughed, a brittle sound devoid of humor. "Amends? For what exactly?" "For abandoning us when we needed you most. For leaving us with nothing while you lived in luxury." Richard shifted uncomfortably, guilt gnawing at him. "I was wrong, Evelyn. I was blinded by my own ignorance and pride. I've regretted it every day since." "Have you?" she asked, a bitter edge to her tone. "Or do you only regret it now that you need an heir?" The accusation hung heavy in the air, stinging him more than he cared to admit. He hadn't expected her to be so perceptive, to cut to the heart of his intentions with a single glance. For a moment, he was lost, fumbling for a response that might break through her defenses. "Evelyn, I know I don't deserve forgiveness. I know I failed you and your mother in ways I can't ever make up for. But please, just consider letting me be part of your life again." She studied him, her face unreadable, though a storm brewed behind her eyes. "You want a daughter now, after all these years? Well, I'm not the same girl you abandoned. I don't need you or your name. I've built my own life, my own success, without the shadow of your wealth hanging over me." He felt his chest tighten, a desperate ache he hadn't anticipated. "But we're family, Evelyn. Blood can't be erased." "Blood," she repeated, her voice thick with scorn. "Blood was the reason you cast us out. You saw my skin and decided I wasn't worthy of your name." Richard opened his mouth to argue, but the words caught in his throat. She was right. His pride, his prejudice, they had poisoned everything. For years, he had justified his actions, convinced himself that he'd made the right decision, that he'd been protecting his legacy. But now, faced with the consequences of that decision, he felt the weight of his own folly pressing down on him. "Please," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "Let me try to make things right." Evelyn's gaze softened, if only for a moment, but the pain in her eyes was unmistakable. "There is no making this right, Mr. Bennet. You chose your legacy over your family. And now you're paying the price." With that, she turned away, leaving him standing alone in the gallery, surrounded by the haunting beauty of her art. A legacy she had built without him, a world she had crafted from the ashes of his betrayal. The encounter left Richard reeling, haunted by her words. She was right. He had lost more than a daughter. He had lost the one chance at redemption, at connection, that might have filled the emptiness in his life. For the first time he was forced to confront the truth. His wealth, his power, they meant nothing without someone to share it with. Back in his office, he stared at the letter she had sent, rereading each word with a growing sense of desolation. His dreams of an heir, of a legacy that would outlive him, seemed to crumble with each passing day. Evelyn had built her own life, a legacy that far outshone anything he could offer. She didn't need him. She had made that abundantly clear. Yet, even in his despair, he couldn't bring himself to let go. She was his daughter, his blood, the only link he had left to a future beyond his own life. Desperation drove him to try again, reaching out to her with letters, invitations, even gifts, each attempt more elaborate than the last. But each one was met with silence, a void that echoed with the same emptiness that had begun to consume him. Months passed, and Richard found himself spiraling deeper into regret, each day a reminder of the family he had cast aside. The walls of his empire felt cold, sterile, stripped of meaning. Bennett Enterprises was flourishing, but what good was it without someone to carry it forward? In his darkest moments, he began to see the truth. He had built a prison of his own making, a monument to his own arrogance and pride. And now, as he faced the final years of his life, he was alone, a man haunted by the ghosts of his own choices. As the days wore on, Richard found himself slipping further into despair. The rejections from Evelyn had left him hollow, and each failed attempt to reconnect chipped away at the foundation of his pride and confidence. It had been so easy back then to cast her aside. He justified it as a necessary decision, convinced himself that he was preserving the purity of his legacy. But now, that legacy felt like a hollow shell, as meaningless as the dust gathering in the corners of his vast, empty home. Driven by a need that he couldn't quite understand, Richard made one final decision. He would meet with Evelyn one last time, face to face. If she rejected him again, he would accept it, though the thought of walking away forever sent a cold, twisting pain through his chest. Evelyn reluctantly agreed, her tone curt as she accepted his invitation to lunch at an unassuming cafe near her gallery. She chose the location, perhaps as a subtle reminder that she was in control this time, that he was the one seeking an audience with her. When she arrived, she barely acknowledged him, her posture rigid as she took her seat. She was dressed simply, yet she exuded a quiet power, a presence that both intimidated and humbled him. For a moment, Richard simply watched her, a strange sense of pride mingling with the guilt that gnawed at him. "Thank you for meeting with me," he began, his voice strained. "Let's get this over with," she replied, her tone clipped. Richard took a deep breath, steadying himself. "Evelyn, I know I can't undo the past. I know I have no right to ask anything of you, but I need you to know that I regret what I did. I regret it every day." She met his gaze, her expression unreadable. "Regret doesn't change what happened, Mr. Bennett." He winced at her formal address, feeling the sting of the distance she maintained. "I understand, but if there's anything I can do to make amends, anything you need, it's yours." A flicker of something, perhaps anger, perhaps sorrow, passed across her face. "Make amends," she repeated, her voice barely a whisper. "You think money can fix this? You think you can buy my forgiveness?" Richard shook his head, his hands trembling slightly. "No, it's not about that. I don't want to die knowing that I never even tried to make things right." Evelyn's gaze softened for a brief moment, but her resolve remained firm. "You want forgiveness. I'm not the same person who needed you, who cried herself to sleep because her father rejected her. I've had to learn to live without you. And I've built a life that has nothing to do with your name, your wealth, or your empire." Richard swallowed hard, her words striking him with a force he hadn't anticipated. He had always thought of himself as the architect of his own life, the creator of his own destiny. But here was his daughter, his own flesh and blood, who had forged a life of her own, independent of him, thriving despite his abandonment. "I understand," he said finally, his voice thick with regret. "You don't owe me anything, Evelyn. I just wanted to tell you that I'm proud of you. And that I'm sorry." For a moment, Evelyn seemed to soften, her gaze dropping to the table. But when she looked up again, her expression was hard, unyielding. "I didn't come here for apologies or to make you feel better about what you did. I came here to tell you that I'm fine without you, and I don't need anything from you. Not now, not ever." The words cut deep, and Richard felt a pang of loss so profound it was as though he were grieving the death of a loved one. He had known deep down that this was the likely outcome, but hearing it aloud shattered whatever hope he had clung to. They sat in silence for a long moment, the weight of unspoken words filling the space between them. Finally, Evelyn stood, her face calm and composed. "Goodbye, Mr. Bennet. I hope you find peace with the choices you made." With that, she turned and walked away, leaving him alone in the cafe, staring at the empty seat across from him. He sat there long after she'd left, the noise of the cafe fading into a dull hum as he tried to process the finality of their conversation. She was gone, truly gone, and he had no one to blame but himself. In the months that followed, Richard threw himself into his work, but the joy and satisfaction he had once felt were gone. Bennet Enterprises was thriving, expanding into new markets and raking in record profits, but it all felt hollow. Each victory only reminded him of the emptiness that lingered in his life. One evening, as he sat alone in his study, surrounded by the trappings of his wealth and success, he came across an article in a high-profile magazine. It was an interview with Evelyn, who had recently held a major exhibition in a prominent New York gallery. The interviewer praised her work, calling her a visionary artist who captures both the beauty and pain of the human experience. Evelyn spoke candidly about her journey, her struggles, and her triumphs, but when asked about her family, she simply said, "My mother taught me everything I know. She's the only family I've ever needed." The words hit him like a punch to the gut. She had built her life without him, found success on her own terms, and achieved more than he could have ever hoped. She didn't need him, not in the way he had desperately wanted her to. His legacy, the empire he had built, would end with him. There would be no heir to carry on the Bennet name, no one to inherit the wealth he had spent a lifetime amassing. As he stared at the article, a deep, unshakable sorrow settled over him. His pride, his arrogance, had cost him the only thing that truly mattered, a family. And now, he was left with nothing but the cold comfort of his success, a hollow victory that brought him no peace. Years passed, and as Richard grew older, his health began to decline. He spent his final days alone, surrounded by the wealth and power that had once seemed so important. But in the quiet hours of the night, as he lay in his vast, empty mansion, his thoughts always returned to Evelyn, to the life he had abandoned, the daughter he had lost. In his last moments, he clung to a single memory, the fleeting image of Evelyn's face, the pride he had felt for her, even as she rejected him. He had built his life on the pursuit of wealth, of power, of legacy. But in the end, all of it was meaningless without the one person who could have shared it with him. As his eyes closed for the final time, Richard's last thoughts were of Evelyn, the daughter he had never known, the legacy he had destroyed with his own hands. He died alone, his wealth and power fading into the shadows, leaving behind only the faint memory of a forgotten heiress, a daughter who had thrived without him. Dear viewers, thank you for watching. If you like this story, please subscribe to our channel to receive more stories every day. Share with us what you think of this story.